Welcome back to Marginal Thoughts.
Great to be here.
So, you ever feel like you need, I don't know, a special decoder ring just to follow the news these days?
Yeah. Especially with economics terms flying around.
Exactly. Like tariffs. That word is everywhere, right?
hmm
And it apparently affects the price of, well, everything. Your phone, maybe your groceries.
It really does. It shapes a lot more than people might think.
But what are they, really? Are they like good, bad,
Yeah.
just complicated? You hear the word, but the details feel kind of fuzzy.
Uh-huh. And how they actually work can seem a bit hidden.
Yeah. So let's try and clear some of that fog today, figure out what these things are and what they might mean for you.
Sounds good. It's definitely one of those topics that impacts everyone, even if you don't immediately see it at the checkout counter.
Right. It feels like some distant government thing, but the ripple effects, they hit close to home.
They do. So we can break down what they are, why governments bother using them, and maybe most importantly, who actually ends up paying for them.
Perfect. Let's cut straight to it then. At the most, like, basic level, what is a tariff?
Simply put, it's a tax.
Just a tax.
Yeah, a specific kind of tax. It's applied to goods when they move across international borders. Usually we're talking about taxes on stuff being imported into a country.
Okay, coming in. Got it. And the actual money collected from this tax, does that have a special name?
It does. It's called a duty, or sometimes you'll hear customs duty.
Duty. Okay.
So if you're bringing goods into the U.S., for example, it's U.S. Customs and Border Protection. They're the ones collecting these duties.
So if I'm a business and I bring in a big shipment of, I don't know,
Yeah.
electronics,
Yeah.
or maybe clothes, or even something super simple like bread from Mexico,
Yep.
all those things could potentially have a tariff slapped on them.
Absolutely. iPhones, umbrellas, shoes, cars, bread, pretty much anything imported could have a tariff.
Wow.
And, these duties really add up. The U.S. government collects billions of dollars from them every single year.
Billions. Seriously.
Hmm?
How much are we talking?
Well, the figures bounce around a bit, but think in the ballpark of, say, $33 billion, maybe close to $35 billion annually.
Whoa. Just from taxes on imports.
Sure.
So does that mean like everything coming into the country gets hit with a massive tax then?
That's the interesting part. Not necessarily a massive tax, at least not on average. If you look at the average U.S. import duty rate across all goods, it's actually pretty low compared to a lot of other countries.
How low?
Often cited around 1.4%.
Okay, 1.4% average. But hang on, I feel like I've definitely heard about stuff getting hit with way, way higher taxes than that. So that average must be hiding something.
It totally is. That average is low because a lot of goods come in with zero tariffs. None at all.
Okay.
But that 1.4% figure masks this huge range. You've got things at 0%, but then others face much higher rates. Shoes, for instance, often have tariffs around maybe 11%.
11%.
But for some specific types of shoes or shoes from certain countries, it could be even higher. So it really varies wildly.
So you might buy something with zero tariff, something with 11%, maybe even way more. How do they actually figure out the amount? Is it always just a percentage?
Not always. There are basically two main ways tariffs get applied. One is called a specific tariff. That's just a fixed fee, like a set dollar amount charged for each item. Doesn't matter how much the item actually costs.
A fixed amount. So like $5 per thing, whether that thing costs $10 or $100.
Exactly. Let's say there's a specific tariff of $3 on every loaf of imported bread.
Okay.
If a simple loaf costs $2 wholesale, you add the $3 tariff, now it's $5 when it enters the country.
Right.
But maybe you're importing some fancy artisan loaf that costs $10 wholesale. It still gets the same $3 tariff, so that one becomes $13. The tax is fixed per unit.
So it hits cheaper items harder, percentage-wise.
It can, yeah. Or think about cars. Maybe there's a $2,000 specific tariff per imported car. A $40,000 car gets hit with that $2,000, but so does a $120,000 luxury car. Same $2,000 tax.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the fixed fee. What's the other method?
The other main type is an ad-valorem tariff. Sounds a bit fancy, doesn't it?
A little bit, yeah.
It just means the tax is calculated as a percentage of the item's value. So we often just call them percentage tariffs to keep it simple.
Okay, percentage. That makes more intuitive sense, I think, like 10% of the price or 20%.
Yeah, let's use that bread example again.
Yeah.
Say there's a 20% ad valorem tariff. If the loaf costs $10, the tariff is 20% of $10, which is $2.
So the final cost is $12.
Exactly. And if you had a fancier $50 loaf, the 20% tariff would be $10, making it $60. It scales with the price.
And I have heard of really high tariffs sometimes. like 100%, or I've even heard 200% mentioned. How does that work with a percentage tariff?
It works just the same way. The percentage is just, well, enormous. If that $10 loaf faced a 100% tariff, that's an extra $10 tax, drives the cost up to $20.
Wow.
A 200% tariff on that same $10 loaf, that adds $20 in tax. Now it's $30.
So the price triples.
Right. And these percentage tariffs are actually very common, probably more common than specific tariffs, because they automatically adjust based on the price of the goods coming in.
Okay, so tariffs are taxes on imports. It can be a fixed fee or a percentage, bring in billions for the government, but the actual rate can be anything from 0 to, well, really high, depending on the item.
Maybe that's the gist of it, yeah.
This sounds like more than just a simple tax grab, though. Why do governments actually use them? What's the point?
Yeah, that's the really crucial question, isn't it? There are a few main reasons governments impose tariffs.
Okay.
One, like we touched on, is just raising money, revenue. That 30-something billion dollar collected, it goes into the government's general funds, helps pay for roads, schools, defense, all sorts of public services.
So reason one,
Yeah.
It's a funding source.
Got it.
What's another big driver?
A really major one is trying to protect domestic industries, local businesses,
Protect them.
by making the imported stuff more expensive. The idea is, if foreign products cost more due to the tariff, then locally made products start to look more appealing, more affordable in comparison.
Ah, okay. So it helps the local guys compete.
That's the theory. It's supposed to help local companies stay in business, maybe even grow, and hopefully keep jobs within the country.
I think I get that logic. Like, if cheap imported widgets cost $1 and the local ones cost $3, everyone just buys the dollar ones, right?
Probably, yeah.
But if you slap, say, a $3 tariff on that imported widget, suddenly it costs $4, and the $3 local one looks like the better deal.
Exactly. You're sort of leveling the playing field, or maybe even tilting it a bit towards the domestic producers. That's often called protectionism.
Protectionism, okay.
So maybe you're a business owner, you import watches from China for $10 each. If a 20% tariff gets added, now they cost you $12 to bring in.
Right.
You might then start thinking, maybe I should look for a watch supplier here in the U.S. instead, see if I can get them for less than $12 and avoid that tariff.
But what if you can't find a U.S. supplier that cheap? Or what if, to make the watches here, you need to import tiny little watch parts? And those parts have tariffs on them too.
See, this is where it starts getting really tangled and complex very fast.
Yeah, I can see that.
Tariffs on one thing can raise costs for other domestic businesses that rely on importing parts or materials. Even if they're doing the final assembly here, it's definitely not always a simple one-step effect.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about another option for that watch importer? Instead of looking for a U.S. supplier, maybe they just say, forget China, I'll buy my watches from, say, India or Vietnam since they don't have this tariff.
That is a very common reaction. Absolutely. Companies will actively look for alternative suppliers in countries that aren't targeted by the tariffs.
So the tariff on Chinese goods might not help U.S. producers, it just helps producers in Vietnam.
It can certainly happen that way. It negatively impacts the country the tariff was aimed at. They lose export business. But it can benefit other countries that step in to fill that gap. Tariffs can definitely redirect trade flows.
Interesting. So shifting trade patterns is another potential outcome. Are tariffs ever linked to, like, bigger economic goals, like the overall balance of trade?
Yes, definitely. Sometimes tariffs are explicitly used with the aim of tackling a trade deficit.
A trade deficit.
Yeah.
But that's when a country imports more stuff, value-wise,
Right.
and exports, right?
Exactly. So the thinking is, by making imports more expensive via tariffs, you might reduce how much people buy from abroad, reduce the total value of imports, and maybe help bring that trade balance closer to even.
Like all the talk you hear about the U.S. trade deficit with China, using tariffs to try and shrink that gap.
Precisely. Making Chinese goods more expensive in the U.S. market has been a stated goal behind some major tariff actions, specifically intended to try and reduce that particular imbalance.
Okay, so let's recap the why. Governments use tariffs for 1. Getting revenue, 2. Protecting local industries, 3. Maybe shifting where trade comes from, and 4. Sometimes trying to fix these big trade deficits.
Those are the main justifications you'll hear, yes.
It sounds like it's supposed to benefit the government and certain local companies.
Yeah.
But who actually pays the price? You hear politicians say things like, oh, the other country will pay for it. Is that true? Does the foreign company selling the stuff pay the tariff?
Okay, this is a really, really critical point, and honestly, it's probably the biggest misunderstanding about tariffs.
Okay.
The foreign exporter, the company in China or Mexico or wherever, they do not pay the tariff tax to the U.S. government.
They don't. Then who does?
The tariff is a tax paid by the importer. That's the domestic company, the American company or individual, who is bringing those goods into the U.S.
The U.S. company buying the stuff from overseas pays the tax.
Yes. And here's the crucial link for you, the listener. While the importer is the one who technically writes the check to customs, where do you think they get that money back from?
Oh, they raise their prices.
Exactly. They almost always pass those increased costs down the supply chain. Ultimately, a significant chunk, often most or even all, of the cost of the tariff ends up being paid by consumers, by you and me.
Wow.
It happens through higher prices on the goods we buy.
Okay, so let's go back to that Mexican bread example. The Mexican bakery sells the loaf for $2. The U.S. puts a, say, $2 specific tariff on it. The Mexican bakery doesn't just eat that cost.
No, the U.S. importer pays that $2 tariff to the U.S. government to get that $2 loaf across the border.
Right.
Now, to keep their own profit margin, that importer needs to sell it for more. They sell it to the grocery store for, say, $4 plus their own markup. Then the grocery store adds their markup.
So that $2 loaf, after the $2 tariff gets paid by the U.S. importer and passed along, ends up costing the American shopper maybe $4.50 or $5.
Something like that, yeah. The tax burden effectively travels right down the supply chain to the final person buying the product at the store.
That really clears it up. It's not the foreign country paying, it's ultimately us.
That's generally how it works, yes. And think about large retailers, the big box stores. They import huge amounts of goods. When tariffs hit those goods, those costs can force them to raise prices pretty much across the board. It affects a massive range of things you might buy every day.
Okay, so the intended benefit might be protecting some local businesses, but a major and likely consequence is higher prices for consumers. That sounds like a big downside. What are some other potential negative effects?
Higher consumer costs is definitely numero uno on the worry list, and it happens a lot. Prices can go up on, well, almost anything imported. Electronics, cars, washing machines, clothes, furniture, food, even surprisingly basic stuff like toilet paper or kitchen towels if the materials face tariffs.
Wow, is there any sense of how much this could cost people?
Well, economists have tried to estimate it. Depending on the scale of the tariffs, some estimates suggested the potential added cost for an average American household could range anywhere from, say, $2,000 a year to maybe even as high as $7,500 annually in some scenarios.
$7,500 a year. That's a huge potential hit to a family budget.
It's significant, yeah. And it tends to hurt people with lower incomes more, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, families on tighter budgets spend a larger proportion of their income on basic goods, food, clothing, household items. If the prices of those things go up, it hits them harder. They have less wiggle room to absorb the increases or switch to more expensive alternatives.
Right, it's a regressive effect.
Okay.
So higher costs, especially for lower income folks. What else?
Another big one is how tariffs can hurt other domestic businesses, the ones that use imported goods in their own production.
Like the sandwich shop needing that imported bread.
Exactly. If the price of their essential bread doubles because of a tariff, their costs suddenly skyrocket. What can they do? They might have to raise the price of their sandwiches, which could drive away customers, or they might just struggle to stay profitable, maybe even have to close down.
So trying to help the local bakery with a tariff could end up hurting the local sandwich shop that buys the bread.
Precisely. It shows how interconnected everything is. You try to help one industry, you might inadvertently harm another one that depends on it.
That makes total sense. It's not just the final thing you buy. It's all the ingredients and parts along the way.
Okay, what happens internationally? When one country puts tariffs on another country's goods, do they just accept it?
Rarely. You run a very high risk of retaliation.
Retaliation.
Yeah. When country A puts tariffs on goods from country B often gets upset and responds by putting its own tariffs on goods coming from country A. These are often called reciprocal tariffs.
Sort of like a tit for tat. Oh, you're taxing our steel. Fine, we'll tax your soybeans.
That's exactly the dynamic. And if this keeps going back and forth, with both sides adding more and more tariffs on each other's products,
it spirals.
It can spiral into what we call a trade war. And in a trade war, usually both sides end up getting hurt. Their exports become more expensive in the other country's market, so they sell less, businesses suffer, jobs can be lost.
Can you give an example of that kind of retaliation hurting a specific U.S. industry? Sure, let's say the U.S. puts tariffs on European cars. Europe might retaliate with tariffs on, say, American-made motorcycles or maybe agricultural products like oranges. Or, a big one historically, if tariffs are put on Chinese goods, China might retaliate with tariffs on U.S. airplanes, from Boeing, for example.
And what would that mean for Boeing?
Well, an airline in China looking to buy new planes might see the price of a Boeing jet go up because of the Chinese tariff. They might then decide, you know what, maybe we'll buy more planes from Airbus in Europe instead since they're relatively cheaper now.
Ouch. So Boeing loses sales, which could impact jobs right here in the U.S. aerospace industry.
Exactly. It's a very direct link between a retaliatory tariff and potential job impacts in the exporting country.
That's clear.
Yeah.
Are there other, maybe less obvious negative effects on the domestic economy or industries here?
Yes, there are a couple more worth mentioning. One is the risk of domestic companies getting, well, lazy, complacent.
Lazy. How so?
If you're a local company and high tariffs are protecting you from foreign competition, you might feel less pressure to innovate or improve your quality or keep your prices down. Why bother working so hard if your customers don't really have cheaper or better foreign options anymore?
Like the Cookie Land example you used earlier.
Mhm.
If they're the only game in town because imports are too expensive, maybe the cookies just aren't as good anymore.
Could happen. Less competition can sometimes mean less incentive to be the best.
Okay, complacency is a risk. What about jobs? The whole point is often protecting jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But can tariffs actually end up costing jobs overall?
This is a really key finding from a lot of economic analysis. It seems counterintuitive, but yes. While tariffs might save or create some jobs in the specific industry being protected, let's say steel production,
Right.
they simultaneously raise the cost of steel for every other industry that uses steel, like car manufacturers, construction companies, appliance makers.
Right.
So those companies face higher costs. They might become less competitive, produce less, maybe even have to lay people off. Studies looking at the impact of steel tariffs, for example, have often found that while jobs were gained in the steel producing sector, more jobs were lost in the steel using sector.
So a net loss of manufacturing jobs overall,
Yeah.
even though the goal was protection.
That's what some significant studies have concluded. Yes, it becomes a trade-off, helping one small group potentially at the expense of a much larger group.
Wow, that's a really important point. And I guess all this fighting over trade, these trade wars, probably doesn't do much good for international relations either.
Absolutely not. Constant tariff disputes, retaliatory actions, it can really sour diplomatic relationships. It makes it much harder for countries to cooperate on other critical global issues like climate change or security when they're constantly bickering over trade.
Okay, let's quickly recap these downsides again, because there are quite a few. We've
Yeah.
got higher prices for consumers, potentially hitting lower-income folks hardest, hurting domestic businesses that rely on imports, the big risk of retaliation and trade wars that hurt our exporters. Domestic companies might get complacent. It could even lead to a net loss of jobs overall and damaged international relations.
That's a pretty comprehensive list of the potential pitfalls, yeah.
It's a significant list. So, given all of that, the big question is, do tariffs actually work? Do they achieve the goals they're supposedly set up for?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating because the answer is it's really debated. And it seems to depend hugely on the specific situation. They definitely don't always work as planned.
Are there any famous examples where people generally agree they were helpful?
One often pointed to is South Korea, back in the 1960s and 70s. They used really high tariffs to shield their budding car industries. Think Hyundai, Kia when they were just starting out. Those tariffs made imported cars super expensive, so Koreans basically had to buy the locally made ones. This gave Hyundai and Kia a protected market to grow in. But crucially, it seems the government pressure and company management meant they didn't just get complacent. They used that protection to rapidly innovate, improve quality, and figure out how to export.
So they used the shield to get strong, not just relax behind it.
It seems that way, yeah. And they also managed their international relations carefully to try and avoid major trade wars. So over time, their car industry became a global powerhouse. In that specific historical case, tariffs arguably played a positive role in industrial development.
Okay, so that's a potential success story under specific conditions. What about a major example where tariffs are widely seen as backfiring or not working as intended?
A big recent one everyone talks about is the U.S.-China trade situation, especially from around 2018 to 2020. The U.S. put tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods.
Right, I remember that. What was the stated goal?
A major goal was to reduce the big trade deficit the U.S. has with China, and also maybe pressure China on things like intellectual property.
It will happen.
Well, China retaliated pretty strongly, didn't they? They put tariffs on U.S. goods, hitting American farmers, particularly hard soybeans, for example.
Yeah, I remember hearing about farmers struggling.
And most economic studies looking back at that period concluded that the U.S. import tariffs generally caused more economic harm than good to the U.S. economy.
How so?
U.S. consumers faced higher prices on many goods, just like we discussed. U.S. farmers and some manufacturers lost significant export sales due to Chinese retaliation. And here's a kicker. While a goal was maybe bringing manufacturing back to U.S.,
Yeah.
what happened in many cases was that companies just moved their production out of China, but not to the U.S. They moved it to other countries not facing the U.S. tariffs, like Vietnam.
So Vietnam kind of became the unexpected winner in the middle of a U.S.-China trade fight.
In many ways, yes. It really highlights how global supply chains work now. You squeeze one part, production just flows somewhere else, often the next cheapest place that avoids the tariff. It didn't necessarily mean jobs came back to the U.S.
That definitely sounds like an unintended consequence and not really achieving the main goal.
It underlines the complexity. You can also look way back in history, like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930 during the Great Depression. Most historians and economists agree that act, which raised U.S. tariffs really high, made the Depression much worse globally because other countries retaliated and global trade just seized up.
So, a historical warning sign.
A big one. Although, to be fair, there was also a period in U.S. history between the Civil War and World War I with very high tariffs. During that time, U.S. industry grew rapidly and government revenue was high from the tariffs, but that era also saw huge economic booms and busts and massive inequality. So the historical picture isn't simple either.
Okay, so historical examples are mixed, maybe leaning towards problematic, and recent large-scale examples seem to show significant downsides and unexpected results. Beyond pure economics, though, are tariffs sometimes used as, like, a political tool?
Oh, absolutely. They can definitely be used as a form of leverage in international negotiations.
How does that work?
A country might threaten to impose tariffs or actually impose them, not just for economic reasons, but to try and pressure another country to do something else, maybe change their policies on intellectual property theft or agree to tougher environmental rules, or even things seemingly unrelated like maybe cooperating more on immigration controls.
So the tariffs become like a bargaining chip in a bigger political game.
Exactly. Do what we want on this other issue or we'll hit your exports with tariffs. It's a form of economic statecraft.
And you also mentioned using them to try and incentivize companies to bring manufacturing back home.
Right. That's often a stated political goal, make it more expensive to import, so companies will choose to produce domestically instead. But as we saw with the China-Vietnam example, that doesn't always work out as planned. Companies might just find a different low-cost country to move to, one that doesn't have the tariffs.
Yeah, the move to Vietnam effect. I also think you mentioned something earlier about potential fairness issues, like exemptions.
Yes, that can be a concern. When tariffs are imposed, governments sometimes create processes for specific companies to apply for exemptions, basically, permission to import those goods without paying the tariff.
Okay.
The issue is these exemption processes can sometimes be complex, maybe not fully transparent, and it raises worries about whether politically well-connected companies might have an easier time getting exemptions than others. That leads to questions about fairness and potential cronyism.
So another potential layer of complexity and concern there. Okay, let's bring this all back home. For someone listening right now, what does all this talk about tariffs mean for you, practically speaking, today and maybe looking into the future?
Well, the first thing is that this isn't just theoretical. Discussions about using tariffs, imposing new ones, keeping old ones, it's very much a live issue. As we're talking now in early 2025, there's ongoing debate about tariffs on goods from various countries.
And it's not just focusing on one country, like China.
No, the discussions are broader now. They include potentially applying tariffs to goods from long-standing allies, too, countries like Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea.
Wow. So this isn't some dusty economics concept. It's actively shaping policy now.
Absolutely. It really signals a potential global shift, maybe moving back towards an era of more economic protectionism after decades of generally freer trade.
And what does that mean for the average person's wallet?
It circles right back to that consumer cost we hammered home earlier. You really need to be prepared for the possibility of higher prices on a whole wide range of goods that you buy.
Pretty much anything that's imported or uses imported components.
That's the potential impact, yes. Economic analysis, almost across the board, agrees that a substantial portion, often the majority of the cost imposed by tariffs, gets passed through to consumers in the form of higher prices.
So economists are pretty much in agreement on that part.
Very high agreement. You see surveys of top economists, panels like the one at the University of Chicago, and there's overwhelming consensus that U.S. consumers bear a significant part of the burden of U.S. import tariffs. And again, some analyses show it can hit low-income households disproportionately harder.
So the bottom line for listeners, these policies are happening now. They could affect a lot of things you buy, and you'll likely be the one paying more for them, potentially hitting those with less financial flexibility the hardest.
It's a really powerful tool governments have, but its effects are complex and ripple out widely, influencing the prices you pay, the jobs available, and how countries interact on the global stage.
Okay, so let's try and wrap our heads around this. Considering everything we've talked about, how they work, the reasons governments use them, like protecting local industries, but then all those potential downsides. Higher costs for you and me, hurting other businesses, risking trade wars, maybe not even achieving the jobs goal, messing with global supply chains.
It's a lot to weigh up.
It really is. Does it seem like tariffs are, I don't know, a necessary evil, a useful tool governments need sometimes? Or are those downsides, especially the cost to consumers and the risk of global conflict, just too significant compared to any potential benefits?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's not abstract. It has very real impacts on your daily life, your budget, and the whole global economy. Definitely something worth thinking more about.
Indeed. It touches everything.
Well, we hope this breakdown has helped make the whole topic of tariffs maybe a little less fuzzy.
Hope so.
We'd love to hear what you think. Let us know in the comments below what are your thoughts on tariffs and their impact.
Yeah, share your perspective. And if you found this conversation interesting and you want more clear explanations of these kinds of complex topics that really affect your life,
Then make sure you subscribe to Marginal Thoughts. We'll catch you next time.
take care.